While no longer an African-American owned company, BET is iconic in that it was the first Black-owned TV network. They've been around for over 40 years, but how did this channel even come to be? The story of BET begins with a look at its founder, Robert Johnson. Robert Louis Johnson was born on April 8, 1946 as the ninth of 10 children to Archie and Edna Johnson. Robert was a good student and had dreams of being a fighter pilot after his brother joined the Air Force. It turned out that his vision wasn't quite good enough to fly, but eventually it would be his vision that would make him a billionaire. The seeds of entrepreneurship were firmly planted in Johnson 15 years before BET's debut. At the age of 19, he had a summer job at Burgess Battery, a factory that produced, well, batteries. Johnson's job at the factory was to sweep the floor of pitch, a sealing wax used in the battery construction. Johnson opted not to continually sweep the floor, but rather to sweep up the pitch periodically as it accumulated, and then make sure the floor was clean at the end of the workday. Johnson's foreman, however, did not agree with this method, and one particular Wednesday, he told Johnson that his last day at the factory would be that Friday. Johnson responded to this impending termination by quitting that very day. The foreman told Johnson as he was exiting that he'd be better off working for himself, as his unique way of doing things meant working for others would not be his cup of tea. While Johnson knew he wanted to do things his own way, he had no idea yet that his future would be in television. After getting his bachelor's in social studies and his master's in international affairs, Johnson had ambitions of being a United States ambassador. Those ambitions took him to Washington, D.C., but not into an ambassadorship. Instead, Johnson's first year in the nation's capital was spent working for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting and the Washington Urban League. After that, he became the press secretary to D.C. Congressional Delegate Walter Fauntleroy. It was during this time that he attended a cocktail party that would put him on his path to BET. While at the party, he struck up a conversation with a woman who suggested he become a lobbyist for the cable industry. This turned out to be more than just cocktail party small talk, as this woman introduced Johnson to the head of the National Cable Trade Association. That meeting led to a job, and Johnson was now immersed in a world of business executives and cable television. This proved to be a fortuitous combination. During his time at the NCTA, Johnson had an epiphany. He realized that cable programming could be segmented and targeted to specific audiences. Johnson surmised that this was already being done in the print medium and with radio stations. So why not cable TV? In 1979, while still a lobbyist, Johnson accompanied a man to see Claude Pepper, a congressman from Florida who chaired the Select Committee on Aging. When Johnson casually asked the man why he needed to see Congressman Pepper, the man shared his idea of a cable channel specifically for the elderly. Johnson asked if he could use the well-detailed business plan for his own idea, then tailored it to fit his plan for a cable channel targeted towards African Americans. The channel for the elderly never made it on the air, but Johnson's idea did. A few months later, Johnson took out a $15,000 bank loan. While this would have been enough to start a rather robust YouTube channel, it wasn't going to build a cable network. Where did the rest of the money come from? Enter John Malone, at the time the CEO of Telecommunications Inc., the nation's third largest cable company, and a board member of the NCTA. The two men had developed a friendship that gave Johnson the opportunity to pitch his cable idea to Malone. Malone invested $500,000. $180,000 of that bought him 20% of the new company. The remaining $320,000 would be a loan. After about 40 minutes, an agreement was drawn up, signed, and the partnership was official. Years later, Johnson remarked that he would have done the deal even if Malone wanted 80%, which would have made this a completely different video. BET launched on January 25, 1980. Its first official program was a rerun of a 1974 movie titled Visit to a Chief's Son. A movie was a logical choice since BET only aired 2 hours of programming every Friday night from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. Its programming aired on the Madison Square Garden Sports Network, which you know today as the USA Network. BET's early programming choices were also a reflection of a conversation between Johnson and Malone. When they signed the partnership deal, Johnson, who had never run a business before, asked Malone for advice. Malone replied, "Keep your revenues up and your costs down." Johnson took this to heart and kept his expenses to a minimum by not spending much money on market research. Instead, he made decisions based on his instincts and also by purchasing low-cost programming, such as blaxploitation films from the 70s, reruns of The Jeffersons, and eventually, music videos by African-American recording artists. He also started slow, gaining another hour of airtime, but staying in that 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. Friday night slot for over 2 years. In 1982, Telecommunications Inc. brought in Taft Broadcasting Company, the parent company of Hanna-Barbera Productions, as an investor. Taft invested $360,000 for a 20% stake of BET. This was enough cash to finance a move to its own satellite signal and expand to a programming schedule of 6 hours daily in August of that year. By the next year, BET was no longer dependent on another channel. It was its own entity. It was around this time that BET started getting music videos provided free to them by record companies. You see, back then, MTV showed little to no videos featuring black artists, and the record companies were eager for exposure. This was a win-win and provided a wealth of content for one of its first original shows, Video Soul, most notably hosted by Donnie Simpson. BET faced many challenges during the early years. This was a channel targeted towards African American viewers, and the big cities like LA, New York, Chicago, and DC, where a lot of urban viewers lived, were taking a long time to get cable TV wiring, so a huge part of their target audience had no way to see their programming. Another challenge was the introduction of subscriber fees. Originally, cable networks provided their programming to the cable operators for free, relying solely on advertising for revenue. However, they all quickly realized this was not enough to maintain profitability and started charging the cable operators fees based on how many subscribers they had. Most cable systems at that time had a limited number of available channels, and with the urban areas experiencing wiring delays, most of the service areas were suburban and rural. Cable operators were reluctant to commit a channel spot to BET, since the majority of the customers that were wired for cable were white. Finally, while BET was up to 6 hours a day of programming, this still presented a problem for the cable operators, which lacked the technology required to switch a channel from BET to something else after it went dark. BET was also criticized for airing reruns of shows instead of original black programming as Johnson had initially envisioned. But in spite of the challenges and criticism, BET prevailed. Let's look at some of the bigger milestones along the way. In 1984, BET hit 6 million subscribers. They also made a deal with ABC to carry their national and international news footage. But the biggest change of that year came in September. BET gave 16% of the company to HBO in exchange for the use of one of its satellite transponders. This deal made it possible for BET to become a 24-hour network. Well, sort of. You see, they filled those 24 hours by combining 6 hours of music videos with 2 hours of other programming. Then this 8-hour block was repeated 2 more times to fill out the day. So in a 24-hour day, 18 of those hours were music videos. With that kind of exposure, no wonder record companies were giving BET their videos for free. In 1985, BET was approaching 10 million subscribers, and cable TV was finally starting to make it to the urban markets in the larger cities. Hope was on the horizon. In 1986, BET passed 12 million subscribers and became profitable for the first time in history. The profits increased over the next few years, as 1987 saw BET's reported profits rise to $960,000 on revenues of $10.7 million, while passing 15 million subscribers along the way. In 1988, the net income more than tripled to $3.2 million on revenues of $15.1 million. 3 solid years of profits were enough for BET to move from a space it was leasing to its own production studio in 1989. BET put this new space to immediate use, creating Teen Summit, a talk show focusing on teen issues. The network shifted into high gear after this and was the first black-owned company traded on the New York Stock Exchange. On October 30th, 1991, 4.2 million shares of the company were sold. It ultimately did not stay a public company for very long. Johnson wasn't too happy with the valuation BET was getting from the market, so in 1998, with the stock price trading around $32, Johnson and Malone bought the outstanding shares and took BET private again. Johnson may not have been thrilled with the company's valuation, but it's hard to argue their success. For fiscal year 1997, its last year as a publicly traded company, BET reported a revenue of $154.2 million and a net income of $23.8 million. As the subscriber count continued to grow, passing 43 million in 1995, BET was expanding its programming as well. In 1996, it ventured even further into the talk show market, adding 2 more talk shows to the long-running Teen Summit. BET Tonight, featuring Tavis Smiley as the host, ran for 5 seasons, and Planet Groove, a music-oriented talk show, ran until 1999. BET's status as a black-owned mega company came to an end in 2001 when it was sold to Viacom for $3 billion in stock options and debt takeover. Johnson wasn't necessarily looking to sell, and BET was not on Viacom's radar. Sumner Redstone, the owner of Viacom, was actually interested in buying the Discovery Channel, which was a Liberty Media property, which John Malone owned after AT&T merged with TCI in 1998. When Malone informed Redstone that the Discovery Channel was not for sale, he inquired about BET. The timing seemed to fit everyone's agenda. Malone and Johnson had been thinking about Malone's BET exit strategy, and Johnson stated that it was never his intent to keep the company forever and pass it down the family line. So, they pulled the trigger, and it was the end of an era. Although Johnson did sign a 5-year deal to stay on as the CEO, after receiving assurances that he would be allowed to run the $60 million subscriber network independently. Later that year, with Johnson at the helm, BET started the BET Awards, beginning an annual gala tradition that still runs today. Robert Johnson's official reign over BET ended on January 1st, 2006. His contract expired, and he chose to retire. Johnson stated that after 25 years of running BET, he simply wanted to do other things. He was succeeded by Deborah Lee, who began her BET career as general counsel in 1986. She left this role in 2018, thus severing BET's ties with its beginnings. As for Johnson, he did indeed go on to other things, which included owning the Charlotte Bobcats and forming RLJ Companies. Since Robert Johnson's departure, BET has had a wealth of original and acquired programming consisting of dramas, comedies, miniseries, and reality shows. It has come under heavy criticism for its programming in recent years by many, including Sheila Johnson, Robert's ex-wife and co-founder of BET. So what about you? Did you watch BET back in the day? Do you watch it now? I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. One thing is clear though. BET's place in television history cannot be denied. Thanks for watching.